So, welcome. So today I'm going to talk about a topic. I'm going to talk about a number of topics. The first one is fighting against something called enshittification or project decay. If you want to use the less vulgar term, it's project decay or platform decay. Some people call it. Some people call it by its more vulgar name. But in any case, this is the phenomena where you build something. You might build a platform, you might build a project, you might build a product, and over time, you sort of get away from the principles that made your project or platform great, or you kind of go, away from your project vision. So, this happens a lot of times. We've seen this with social media platforms. We've seen this with consumer products. And I'm going to go through some of the things that in the literature where they talk about this phenomena and how you can actually use this as sort of a cautionary tale for your projects. So we'll be talking about project longevity and project uh, design, like the project life cycle later in the semester. But for right now, we're going to talk about basically how platforms decay and how to sort of prevent it and how to think about this as a long-term strategy. So, Cory Doctorow, who is a media critic and a technology critic, did a McLuhan lecture on enshittification. That's his term. And this is on his Medium. It just kind of goes through the lecture. And he proposes in that lecture a couple of points, sort of sequential points for how platforms decay. And so at the right, you see this smiley face, and it's sort of undergoing this entropic process, or it's kind of jumbling up over time. So basically, it's like this idea that your platform starts in the way you intended. You are able to apply the principles, the guidelines, and everything is running smoothly. And then you make a series of decisions. And sometimes they're not so intentional, sometimes they're very intentional to get away from that recipe, get away from that formula, and do other things. And there are a lot of reasons why people do this, and we'll get into that later. But um, this is something that is can be harmful to both the people buying into your platform and the organization itself. So your organization might, uh, you know, undergo this sort of bad transformation and might ultimately fail. So there's three steps to how platforms decay. They're proposed by Dr. O. The first one is, starting out, your platform is good. You have a really nice product, and sometimes it's even free. And as a result, you attract a lot of users. People have really good things to say about your platform. It has a lot of goodwill built around it. We talked about this when we talked about social capital. So you do a good job building a platform or a project. You offer it to people, sometimes for free. Maybe there's a small fee. But if people agree and there's this contract that you build, this sort of relationship you build with your customers, your users. But then in step two, you might notice that, say, you have business customers who are, maybe paying a lot of money for the service. Maybe you offer things to your business customers and your users are there and they're using it and they're, not business customers, and they kind of get a different version of the product, but they're not paying you very much money. So you might have like a board of directors, or you might have sort of an imperative to say, we want to support the thing that makes us more money. And this is something that, people do because they want to be financially sustainable, or they think that that's, the way that they think is that, you need to maximize your profits or maximize your organization. And so in doing so, you end up, um, you might emphasize the business aspect or the enterprise aspect and really kind of neglect your user base. So a lot of times, companies or platforms or projects will have like two tiers. They'll have a business tier and an individual tier, and they'll do things differently for those customers. And you have to think about like maintaining your product, right? So you have to think about what are the things we're going to offer the regular users and the business users. And if you focus on your business customers, you maybe offer them new innovations or you offer them support, and then your regular users don't get any of that. And so that kind of poisons the well with your regular users, and they kind of become disillusioned, and you break down that social capital that you built up initially. Now, step 3, of course, is where you're going down the road of step 2, but then you make things worse by then abusing those business customers to claw back all the value for yourself. So this means that maybe you focus on your business customers, you neglect your users, your user base falls in terms of the individual users, and your only real users anymore are your business users. So to make up for that, you might raise the prices for business users. You might, cut corners. You might not maintain things as well. Or you might do things that, kind of instead of investing in your platform or your project or your product, you just kind of take the profits. And that's, something that sometimes boards of directors will demand sometimes, or sometimes if you have a founder, they might want to do that. So there again, there's this social capital that you build up that you can squander. You can also squander the trust of your team by people, having different conflicting wants and needs, and kind of going down the road of easy profits or easy value. So, and then of course you end up with a decayed platform because at some point then the business customers leave and you're left with nothing. And there are a number of examples of that in the world. I don't really need to go through those. But, this is something that you can read about more if you're interested, because I think it's a very interesting kind of way of thinking about, how things can go bad in a lot of projects. So when we talk about platform decay, I gave you this sort of path to ruin. And this has several causes. So, like I said, it could be just kind of greed. It could be kind of, thinking short term, thinking about optimizing your financial situation or optimizing things in a way that kind of ignores your customers, ignores the product itself, ignores your original vision. And so, but there are several causes to this. You might say, why would people do this intentionally? And the answer is they don't necessarily do it intentionally. It's something that kind of arises from things that you do, and you don't even realize you're doing it until it's too late. So the first cause is behavioral. So this is where we have this sort of predatory behavior, or this predatory decay. This is where organizations will engage in predatory activities. And they do this because they figure they can make, they press this easy button for profits, and they think, well, we can make money off of this product. We have a winner. Let's milk customers for all they're worth, or even more. So, there are a lot of ways that this happens, this kind of predatory behavior. You can overcharge for services, intentionally knowing what the market rate is. You can overcharge, especially if you're in a situation where you have a unique product. You can base your financial model on rents. So in economics, there's this term called rent seeking or rentier capitalism, where organizations will base their financial sort of bottom line on charging rents or fees for things that are really kind of made up, or maybe things that if they weren't in a situation where they were like a monopoly or had a unique product, they wouldn't be able to charge. Then there's planned obsolescence. So planned obsolescence is where you either have poor quality control, or you sometimes use your predatory behavior to say, we're going to build products that don't really last very long. So then someone has to come back and buy another one later. So, like, sometimes people will build products that maybe last 2 years and you have to go buy another one after 2 years. when in fact those kind of products used to last a decade or more. Or maybe you can't fix the product, you can't repair it, and that's by design because they want you to buy another copy or another uh, thing that they're selling. You can also have poor quality control. So just poor quality control is, not spending money on quality control, making sure that it fails frequently. And so they either have to come to you for support or they have to come to you for a new product altogether. So basically, you're trying to get money out of people or get something out of people, but it's intentional because you don't build a quality product. So this is, again, another thing that you can do, and it's not a great thing. And again, maybe a strategy because you can't afford quality control for your products. Um, but people will see that as not being a good value. And so that can hurt you down the road, especially in terms of this building up social capital, building up goodwill, building up trust. Another one is kind of something that people kind of approach their projects very enthusiastically, but in fact, too enthusiastically, and it hurts them later. So we're going to be talking about a topic called technical debt. We're going to do that in the next unit. And I don't know how many of you have heard of technical debt, but the idea behind technical debt, really quickly, is that you have like these costs when you start a project, you adopt like say your workflow, you have make certain decisions, and there's a cost to making those decisions. And sometimes that cost can be so great over time that you can't pay down the debt and you end up suffering as a result. So if you base your project on a obscure programming language no one can learn, or if you base your program on a platform that goes defunct and then you have to migrate to a new platform. Those are examples of technical debt. And so there's this cost that you pay for it later in the project. So keep that in mind. But right now, I want to talk about complex sets of features being a cause of platform decay. So what will happen sometimes in projects is that people will start a project. They'll say, I'm going to build this product, and version one is going to have 30 features. And then we're going to keep going with more and more features. We're going to keep adding features, and we're going to have hundreds of features by maybe like the fifth version. And that sounds great on paper. But, and you can think of like examples of products where you have like many, many features, hundreds of features, like something like Windows or Mac OS. And the thing about Windows and Mac OS is they're run by large corporations that have the resources to support all of those features. And sometimes even they don't. So they kind of deprecate features. They can deal with like security patches or whatever. But for you as a smaller organization, you might say, we're going to have 30 features on the first version and then just keep expanding. Well, what happens after about 2 or 3 years, or maybe several versions ahead, is that those features start to decay. They either start to get old or they start to, uh, bugs will rear their head. They're not compatible with newer computers, operating systems, phones, and you don't have the ability to support all of that because you're a small organization. So that means that you can't really have a huge number of features, probably at all, but definitely not to start out with. So sometimes people will be really enthusiastic, add in all this perceived value, and then it turns out that they're hurting themselves later. So this causes that complex features can provide initial value. In the version one, maybe that's good. Maybe it's good to have 30 features. But in version two, then you start to have problems with maintaining them and, adding more features. And sometimes they interact poorly. So you just can't deal with it as an organization. So sometimes these complex sets of features can provide initial value, but often have diminishing returns. So sometimes, you have this great plan. You're going to put 30 features in your product, and then you don't understand that they interact poorly when you program them out, or you Maybe even you don't even get to release. Maybe you just say, I'm going to put these features, we're going to plan for these features. And then when you start working on them, you find out that they don't work well together at all. So, but sometimes having a lot of features makes it hard to repair things and they add little value to the product. So there's this law of diminishing returns where you add a few good features into a product and it's great. You add 10 more and it's not so great. And there's a law of diminishing returns there where you're not getting the value out of adding things to the product. You can't necessarily be all things to all people. This is why I asked you in your open canvas to sort of define your sort of target audience or your target demographic for what your product or your project is. Because you don't want to be everything to everyone. At the same time, you want to target the things, specialize in the things that really help the people you want to reach. So that's why I focused on that. Now, there's this other article from Ethical Pixels, and this is what is enshittification and why quality and UX matter more than ever. So they actually go through and they say um, that they kind of think about platform decay and the online experience or the experience with some product like a mobile app or some program. And so this is where a social media platform. So they kind of assume that platform decay has occurred, and they say it degrades the online experience in a number of ways. So the first of these is an over reliance on ads or commercialization. So if you say you design a website for your project and you start out and it's great, you have a nice design, and you decide we really need to make some revenue, let's add some ads into this. So you start putting in ads, banner ads maybe, or some pop-up ad. But you keep doing this, you keep pushing that button for more financial reward. And eventually what happens is you have this unusable website with like 10 ad banners or pop-ups, and you can't really navigate it. And it really degrades the original intent, which was to build a nice website to be informative. Sometimes commercialization does the same thing. Like you can have the same effect where you kind of stress commercialization over product development. And so you're selling things, but you're not selling, you start selling something someone wants, and then you start selling them other things that they don't necessarily want. And then pretty soon, no one gets what they want. The second point is compromising user privacy. We talked about this in the open data lecture where we were talking about, dealing with, uh, privacy and data and making sure that what kinds of data are, confidential or, you have to have privacy standards in your project, in your community standards, in your product design and so forth. And so a lot of times, like Apple prides themselves as a company on having features that protect people's privacy, and that's a selling. Other companies sometimes compromise privacy because they don't want to deal with the infrastructure that goes along with protecting privacy. And it's worth noting that um, a lot of companies, privacy policies take a lot of effort and it takes a lot of this social capital. It also confers social capital. In the case of Apple, people trust the company more. Maybe they shouldn't, but Um, but anyways, that's the way it works. You just don't want to compromise user privacy, and sometimes that happens in bad ways. The third is over reliance on algorithmic automation, which is where we automate some process. And of course, we always like to automate things if we can because we want to make things more efficient. But again, over optimization is bad. And I bring this up especially with a lot of people are interested in doing things with AI in their projects, and AI is used a lot of times by organizations nowadays, anyways, as sort of a cure-all. So they'll just say, "Well, we'll throw AI at it, and we'll solve the problem. We can put AI in a product. We won't necessarily be very specific as to what it does, but we'll put it in." And so there's this temptation to over rely on automation, algorithmic automation, and other types of automation as a solution to your problems. We'll talk about automation later in the course as well, and we're going to consider it from this kind of critical perspective where we think about, like, are we using automation the way we should be using it? Are we over relying on it? Are we trusting it too much or whatever? Um, and so sometimes, like with uh, social media feeds, we have algorithmic automation there that can, if you don't invest in it in the right ways, it cannot be great. Um, you can also have, like, AI embedded in something, and it maybe does it creates more barriers to doing what you want to do than it doesn't. So sometimes with, like, I don't want to pick on uh Office, Microsoft Office and Word, but sometimes you'll have tools in Word that will try to correct your writing or something, and it doesn't do a very good job of it. So it takes you more time to undo that and redo it than otherwise. Sometimes you get things like the classic Clippy icon or the classic Clippy agent that used to be in Microsoft Excel, where you would, it would pop up in the corner of the screen and say, "Can I help you?" And it's really distracting, and it doesn't really help you. So that's another example of that. The fourth example is user exploitation. So user exploitation, of course, is charging rents for things, or sometimes you exploit their, you know, privacy data or whatever. This is something that you have to think about. Basically, thinking about the user, not thinking about them as sort of like a number, and kind of really not just creating a nice looking interface, but thinking about their experience from their standpoint, and not exploiting them in different ways. And then finally, lack of maintenance. So again, like I said, you have to maintain everything that you build. Sometimes projects will decay or platforms will decay simply because they haven't been maintained. They might, you might not hire people to maintain the technology. And so over time it decays, you lose functionality, you have bugs, it goes offline sporadically, and it's a bad experience. So, then we might ask, how do we combat platform or project decay? And a lot of the answers are very similar to the ones I talked about in working open. So there's similar principles to working open, and they can be used to combat platform decay. And so the first is interoperability. So interoperability is where you don't want to lock yourself into any one technological solution or technological platform. Like I said, with open data, you have different file formats, different standards that last, you know, decades instead of maybe being a proprietary solution that lasts like 2 years. You want to be able to do that because your users are demanding different ways to use the product. The second one is having good digital rights management. And by that, I mean, we talked about the open source licenses, the, open media licenses, having those things spelled out, spelling out what they can and cannot do, but also having digital rights management be seamless. So if you've ever used ebooks and you've used an e-reader, you know that some e-readers are very good at, like, taking a book, opening it up and letting you read it. And some really kind of give you a lot of friction where you have to kind of pick the right, format, and you have to get a code, and you have to, it's just like, you have to do a lot of things to get to that thing that you want to do. And so, people knowing what they can and can't do, and then having like a good experience, user experience, is pretty good way to ensure that things don't decay, although that doesn't isn't foolproof. Technological innovation. We also talked about technological innovation, where you have, you're trying to achieve innovation, and the reason you're trying to do that is because you want to stay ahead of a lot of changes in the world. So if you have security challenges, for example, innovation can help you stay on top of that. If you have new technologies that come out, you can innovate your way to kind of incorporating those things effectively, or overcoming the challenges they present. So there are a lot of, technological innovation can combat platform decay, but again, that's also not foolproof. And then public engagement or engaging with communities, knowing what people want out of their platform or product and serving their needs. So, in the next unit, we're also going to talk about discussions and discussion forums and managing a community, open source community. And this is a form of public engagement. So, you're going to engage with the public. You say, what things do you want to see? What kinds of features do you want to see? Instead of just putting features out there that people may or may not want to use. So, getting feedback from your user base is good policy. Now, I'll talk about the free and open source software movement, which I talked about earlier in the unit, as an example of how you can overcome project decay. This is a particular sort of method for project management where you have these strong principles, and it's kind of matching your goals of avoiding project decay. So in FOSS, we do a lot of things. It's free access, it's open source. And one of the things it does is allow for continuous improvement driven by a community rather than some sort of market where you have bad actors and you have bad incentives. So, you know, I want to highlight continuous improvement because this is something that you can implement in GitHub. You can implement it in the production process. But it's also something you implement in your teams as a process. And this is something that Agile stresses, which are these, continuous loops of feedback and improvement upon the product. So in FOSS, instead of having someone making unilateral decisions about what features are in a product, or a team just kind of fumbling their way through, putting features into a product, you are allowed, you have this in continuous improvement. You start with, say, like a prototype, you demo the prototype, you evaluate it, you go back and improve it, you keep improving things. You might make a release, and then in the next version, you can improve the things that you released in the first version. And you get feedback from your community, so people use it, they give feedback, they might suggest changes to make it better. So this is like one of these things that can really kind of stop project decay or fight project decay. Although again, it's not, you have to have the right leadership, you have to have the right team and the right community for this to work. Something like free and open source software aligns with open access and right to repair and to modify. So if you might have heard of right to repair, right? Of course, we talked about right to modify. Right to repair is where you're allowed to repair your own product. And sometimes that's very important because people can't afford to say, go to a certified dealer or wait for support to solve a very trivial problem. Some products are notorious for not allowing people to repair their own things, and that feeds back into this notion of uh, planned obsolescence. Now, when you have an open project, when you have open sort of principles, it allows for a more diverse and user-oriented set of design choices. So again, if you get feedback from your community, they can tell you the kind of features they want to see. You can also get this sort of feedback about what it should look like. Free and open source software also aligns with the values of accessibility and transparency, and that feeds into that idea of collective governance, showing the community what you're doing, maybe getting feedback on that, but also just kind of, if there's a bad decision to be made, everyone can see it and maybe identify it before it happens. Finally, decentralization of this type discourages platform decay as new forks can continue at scale development. So we talked about forking, which is where you take a repository, the original project, and you make a copy of it and you build a modified version of it, or you do something with it, and it's independent of the original project. So if the original project falls into disrepair, if the team is no longer working seamlessly, if they don't no longer have the resources to do what they were doing, a fork can take over that development. They may be able to just take it over outright or have a slightly modified version to move forward. So the platform doesn't decay so much as it splinters, but that's still better than decay. So this idea of continuous improvement is something that you can implement in GitHub. It's also a very good principle in project management because it gives you this ongoing effort to improve products, services, or processes. So again, continuous improvement is sort of tied to what they do in Agile, which is where they come up with maybe like a prototype of something, they evaluate it through a demo, you get feedback, you build a second version, you do the same thing. You keep doing this until you get it really well, well conceived of. You then move and you release it into the world, and then after that, you get feedback and you release a better version in the next version of the product, and so forth. You can also use continuous improvement in your workflows, so you can evaluate your workflows as people work through them. You can change the number of steps that you're using or the technologies that you're using, and you can identify any problems quickly instead of waiting until it becomes too late. So continuous improvement really is a way to sort of, evaluate this in an ongoing manner. So a lot of organizations will, you know, have a structure of like, meeting every week or every month about different aspects of their project. Like they may have like a feature meeting every week, or they might have, some sort of community meeting every month. And in those meetings, they evaluate things like workflows and features in a product or something else, and they will then, be able to address things in shorter time spans than if you would if you just put a bunch of features out there and let people like kind of let the market decide. So this allows you to make incremental improvements over time. So you can, obviously make iterative changes and changes for the better, but you can also work towards a breakthrough improvement. So, breakthroughs are usually considered these large scale game changers that, help you sort of really kind of build an innovation that shines. But to do that, you need to make these incremental improvements. And it's not just automatic. You have to have the right culture in place. You have to have the right process in place. And continuous improvement allows you to do that. These the next point is that delivery or customer valued processes are constantly evaluated and improved in light of their efficiency, effectiveness, and flexibility. So you're really kind of evaluating things, not in terms of optimization, but there is this efficiency imperative, but there's also this effectiveness imperative. How effective is it? And then this flexibility imperative. How easy it is for you to change course when you need to, when the world changes, or when you have a change in your customer base or what have you. So continuous improvement is actually based on the Kaizen method. And the Kaizen method is something that Japanese companies implemented in like the 60s and 70s when they were trying to really kind of build a system where they had good quality control and good control over their industrial process. And Kaizen in Japanese means change, good, improvement. So it's like kind of this all purpose word. And so it's basically, we want to induce change, we want to do a good job, and we want to improve that good job. So, like, basically, there are three sort of principles in the Kaizen method. There's feedback, which is the core principle of continual process improvement. And this is the self reflection of processes. So, you want to sit down every week and look at or every month, look at your workflows, look at your roadmap, make sure that you're on course for things. And this is something that's incorporated into Agile as well. So we'll talk about Agile and we'll talk about how they approach feedback driven management of things. There's also efficiency. So the purpose of continual improvement processes is the identification, reduction, and elimination of suboptimal processes. So this is where we look for things that are sort of potential decay sources, and we kind of get rid of them, or we try to improve them so that they are no longer sources of decay. So again, it's not about over optimizing your organization. It's about identifying problem points before they become bigger problems and saying we should get rid of those. And then the evolution of the project. So the emphasis of continual improvement processes is on incremental, continual steps rather than giant leaps. Again, you can achieve those giant leaps. You just need to have a basis of, they need to be based on these incremental, continual steps. And then you end up making these giant leaps that you can then release out into the public. But within the project, there are these incremental, continual steps that you improve upon, every week or every month. So and then of course, none of this is immune to like bad acting or people who do things that are nefarious. So that's something else to keep in mind. That's a whole separate thing. Okay. So another way to kind of fight project decay, and again, like I said, sometimes people are just bad actors. Sometimes people do things, with a bad intent. But sometimes, a lot of times, project decay is due to things that we don't think about consciously, and we just do them. And sometimes they result from best intentions, which is even worse. So sometimes project decay is due to like project management and planning. Sometimes it deals with communication and developing better communication strategies than you might otherwise adopt. So, in Agile, again, one of their foci in that type of project management is good communication across the team, having good communication channels overall, and maintaining those good communication channels with good practices. So there's this book by Jason Fried and David Heinemeier Hansen called It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work. And their point in this book is that there are a lot of things people do in their workflow that are maybe not great for productivity, not great for preventing things like project decay or platform decay. So we do things that we think are improving ourselves, like 80-hour work weeks, packed schedules, endless meetings, overflowing email inboxes, unrealistic deadlines, working on the weekends, doing all-nighters and stuff like that. And the idea is that may seem like you're really busy and you're really successful, but that's not really the way to manage a project or a team. The better way to do this is to not necessarily be intentionally hectic. It's to have good strategies going forward that can help you filter out the noise. And so that's where Inbox Zero comes in. So you may have heard of Inbox Zero. It's a technique that people talk about to manage email messages in an inbox. So if people who are team project leaders or professionals or even professors, they always complain about having many, many emails that they have to go through and, kind of sort them out or kind of, answer everyone, or it just becomes an overwhelming thing and it takes up a lot of time. So people have come up with this idea of inbox zero. And it's important to realize that inbox zero, when I say this, it's not about having zero messages at the end of the day or reducing your load to zero. It's about aligning your inbox and by extension, your communication strategy to your workflow. So if your team has a particular workflow, you want to align your communication strategy to that. Now, you also want to make sure that your workflow isn't hectic and ripe for collapse or ripe for decay, but that's another issue. So this is Inbox Zero is actually based in cognitive neuroscience, and the cognitive neuroscience Sahara Youssef describes it thusly. Multitasking is a myth. So if you may have been familiar with multitasking, you might be looking on your phone right now in addition to paying attention to the lecture. And not to pick on you, but I'm going to kind of use this as an example. So when you're multitasking, you're doing two things at once, you're switching your attention. So multitasking is a myth. In reality, it's rapidly switching from one task to another. So you're switching between paying attention to the lecture and your phone, and then back again. So you're switching back and forth. And every time you make that switch, so every time I move from my phone to my Zoom to back to my phone, um, you pay a tax on both of your time and your energy. So if I move from the phone to the screen to the phone, I've paid a tax of shifting my attention twice. And so the tax there is that you lose the ability to pay attention to either task, and you lose kind of your place, and you spend a lot of energy, and it's not good. So people will multitask. You'll even get interfaces that are set up for multitasking, but there is this cost that you pay, and it's cognitive, but it's also productivity related. For this reason, it's almost always efficient to monotask. That is, focus on one thing and then move on when you're done, so you don't pay unnecessary switching taxes. Basically, instead of saying, I'm going to answer my emails while I pay attention to a meeting, or I spend, I go to my email, I go to a meeting, I go back to my email. You may have a strategy where you can address all of your emails in 1 hour in the morning and then move on with your day. And it's much better for productivity. It's much more efficient from the standpoint of getting the information you need and not being tired out, burnt out. So this is a personal productivity point, and this is actually a blog post here by Merlin Mann on this strategy for inbox zero, which is action-based email. This is where they talk about reduced context switching, and their strategy for this is focusing on your work and picking specific regular times to address messages. So, again, you want to, kind of answer all of your communications and address them, but you don't need to do it kind of in a way that's counterproductive. You also want to sort of focus on those things instead of just kind of going through the motions. So this is another post from 40 Pound Head blog. What is inbox zero and how can you achieve it? And they give some points here for how to do this. The first is using regular email checks. So it's like, you might do this maybe 4 times a day where you go back and you kind of answer a certain tranche of emails and then come back and do another tranche. And then you end up doing the entire group of relevant communications throughout the day. But you don't spend, you don't switch from your email to a meeting or switch from your email to some other task that you're doing. And so, people have there's a temptation to do that, and you have to structure your day accordingly. The second is the 2-minute rule. So, this is where we have these simple action items that we can prioritize. Basically, if you can address an email in a 2-minute response, do so. Otherwise, leave it for later. So you're prioritizing some emails over others. And if you can do that, you can kind of cut down on your workload. We'll talk about prioritization strategies in a few units. And labeling we're providing metadata for your messages, putting them in folders or putting labels on them so you know at least where they belong, and you may address them later, but you know what they're about. You can, especially if you're using something like Slack, you can filter your messages, unsubscribe from things you don't immediately need, archive or delete things, and it's a criterion for focusing. So maybe you don't need to answer every message. You need to figure out which ones are relevant and then answer those, or which ones are highest priority and answer those first. So that's basically how they describe, or they suggest how to do this. And again, it's not about doing this any one way. You just try to do it to fit your workflow. Now, the problem with inbox zero, and this is a post from Martine Ellis, uh, the problem with inbox zero has uh, has always been about sort of devising a process for managing emails. So some people interpret inbox zero to literally, where they kind of just think that you should empty your inbox daily. What you really need to do is not to empty, make it a goal to empty your inbox, although you should try to address everything you need to address. Um, you just need to have a good strategy and get through all of the emails that are relevant and don't worry about like counting down to zero because that can induce anxieties of its own. So, this is again thinking about the strategy fitting your workflow, but also fitting sort of the cognitive, um, making things cognitively easier for you. So, inbox zero is often misunderstood as the need to have zero emails in your inbox, but the solution isn't always to read incoming emails immediately. When you focus on always maintaining zero emails in your inbox, you're spending as much time worrying about your empty inbox as you would over a full one. So it's really about rethinking your relationship to your inbox instead of a race to racing the clock. And so Andrew Bosworth from Meta has proposed Inbox 10, which is his own version of Inbox Zero, where he basically aims to end every day with fewer than 10 emails in his inbox. He aims to have fewer than 10 open chat threads across all interfaces. He needs to read all relevant notifications in internal tools, all relevant posts in internal groups, and having, the sort of going across your communications, prioritizing things, and kind of addressing the things that need to be addressed for the day. So having the sort of priority of communication channels as well is important. So again, this is all about personal productivity, but it's also about, you know, being able to address all of the communications across your teams. And when you miss communications, of course, you miss important information about, things that you're doing in your project.